They get the very first Why Now Brown Cow Award of the afternoon. Next, we're going to have James Dickenson, who's ecologist with the Eastern Washington area, as well as Darren Gooding, who is the Forest Environmental Coordinator, who you saw on the panel earlier. And they're going to talk about the Upper Wenatchee Watershed Restoration Project.
Forward, back, laser.
Perfect. Good afternoon. Thanks for having us. I think this is a great workshop. I think it's a long time in coming for those of us who've been on the ground trying to make landscape ecology work in the management environment. So first of all, I want to start off by saying this was the successes that we're finally starting to see in many of our projects are a result of a lot of hard work from both the P&W station and the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest, as well as at this point a bunch of our collaborators outside of the agency. As Darren mentioned earlier, we already have a very strong trust environment, so just kind of funnel that in the back of your head as we're talking about some of these things. Really quickly, I'm going to just cover some ecology. We had some great talks this morning. I just want to kind of touch base on a couple of points that we look at when we're going through our analysis process, so that you understand what our kind of our underlying principles are, and then I'll move into landscape analysis and how we're actually applying it. Talk about some coarse filter approaches that we're trying to utilize more efficiently, and then convert that over to planning. And then Darren's going to talk about a lot more of the specifics of the Upper Wenatchee project in terms of how that's moving forward through NEPA and other planning aspects. So functional landscapes, large-scale functional landscapes really rely upon having the processes, underlying processes, firing and working correctly. Those underlying processes are dependent upon the interactions that are happening at finer scales, finer and finer scales, all the way down to individual stands of trees or individual trees themselves, both the live and the dead wood. Basically restoring or creating resilience on these landscapes then involves understanding those processes at multiple scales. I believe Michelle mentioned that with the ecology or the human aspect of it. But multiple scale analysis is really important. It helps us to establish how things are interacting amongst themselves as well as between themselves for different types of characteristics. For a number of decades, we've really effectively managed the heck out of our stands on the ground. We've done a really good job. I mean, that is the legacy of the U.S. Forest Service. And that is not a judgment whatsoever on that past management, but rather, as managers, we're very focused on the stand level part of our jobs. And one of the issues that you might hear me mention later is getting people to understand that landscape ecology is actually not the one stand you're standing in having discussions about what you're going to do. It's actually about what's happening across the rest of that landscape. Whether that stand is a stand that's vulnerable or a stand you're going to treat, in other words, a stand that you're going to protect or a stand that you're going to treat, it really matters how you manage around that stand as much as it matters how you manage in the stand. So it's about the landscape, the mosaic, it's also about the stand itself. So when you're looking at your favorite stand, and if you're all wondering, that's the same stand. I took one graphics arts course in my lifetime, and I loved the whole discussion on negative space drawing. Blew me away. That's the same stand. It probably set me up well for being a landscape ecologist. But that's the same stand. And you know, when you're looking at that one stand, understanding the quantity that it represents, you know, that's obviously something of interest. I've delineated it. It's of interest to me. But what's the quantity? What's the configuration? What's the uniqueness of that stand? And what are the interactions of that stand? I can't answer any of those questions if I'm looking at just that stand. So it's critical to actually establish the context of that stand within the landscape. And in this case, what I've got shown up here is the context between it and its other like stands, its other neighbors that are like it. But the reality is that conversation, again, needs to be built also around the mosaic. What's the matrix of conditions between it and its neighbors? The wildlife piece talked a lot about you know, edge effect and how we have connectivity. This is all important. And the challenges are that as we drill down in scale, those complexities grow exponentially. So we developed a forest restoration strategy. I believe the first one, we started working on it in 2009. There was some overlap with our forest plan revision at the time, which did not complete the forest plan revision. But we developed a restoration strategy. This doesn't need to be a surprise. We developed a restoration strategy that was intended to start utilizing what we knew about landscape ecology, what we learned over the last 20 years through the Interior Columbia Basin Project, through the hundreds of research papers that were co-authored by local managers and the P&W station. The key pieces here, we really wanted to focus on creating resilient landscapes and knowing that we had changing climates. The day of the Northwest Forest, well, not the day, the year the Northwest Forest Plan was signed, we'd already lost a third to a half of our LSR network for spotted owls. And that trend has not slowed down except for the occasional years like 19. So creating resilient landscapes and changing climates, working across landscapes, focusing on desired restoration outcomes. We didn't care about the products. What we wanted to focus on was what were we doing with that landscape. It had already been gut shot by dozens of years of 100 million, even arguably billion or half billion board foot years of timber harvest. We don't have large trees. Those are legacy characteristics that we care about on our landscape, and they're important from a disturbance perspective. So we want to continue to develop that and adapt strategies that help us move forward and monitor. So I'm going to be pretty focused on the terrestrial piece because that's really where the landscape ecology kicks in. We do have an aquatic evaluation component. There's a fair amount of work that goes into it. It is fairly road-centric. But really, when you look at our current hydrologic systems, our aquatic systems, it's about roads really impacting it right now. And moving on to some of the things that Gordy presented this morning, I think are fantastic. I hope we're turning that corner in the not too distant future. So coarse filters and fine filters. I decided to kind of take this tack for this approach for this talk because we're starting to go down that direction when we come to 2012 planning rules and we start talking about a lot of things. Like I said, as you dig into the complexity, as you get finer and finer scale information, the accuracy gets more and more difficult, the complexity of making decisions, the challenges of balancing out trade-offs becomes exponentially larger and more difficult. And in my opinion, on my unit, our managers are struggling already with the burden of decision-making that's happening. So coarse filter basically is a focus on looking at these large-scale processes, really managing for the large-scale processes and allowing the fine-scale variability, the fine filter information to kind of pop up from the bottom. We can manage with those two filters in place where we are focused on creating broader scale functionality within larger areas, primarily through structure and cover and composition, as you see over there on the right. That's a primary way of managing it because understanding the patterns, understanding how disturbance, fire and East Cascades, how those interact is really important for having something maintaining through time. And ideally it's resilient, right? Hopefully we've set it up for resilience through time. The fine filter piece really comes into play though. We're trying to protect pieces of our existing habitat. Spotted owl habitat is a big one. Riparian corridors are also big ones in our part of the world. So understanding how we're going to take those pieces and really plug them in and protect them while achieving this landscape resilience is a challenge. And we feel like we have a pretty good approach with that. So a lot of our work's based on the Columbia Basin project, completed in the mid-90s. Primarily, we use their methodology and their reference conditions for historical range of variability, which is based on photo interpretation. They basically took 350 odd landscapes, if I remember correctly, photo interpreted them for crown closure, species, canopy, size classes, logging, clumpiness, crown differentiation, overstory, understory, several 10 or more different attributes. And they classify those to derive things like forest structure, cover type, owl habitat, various habitats actually, insect and disease vulnerabilities, and also developed a crosswalk with Roger Ottmar and others at P&W to actually relate that back to historical ranges of fuels. So we have a fairly robust reference condition when we talk about historical range of variability. There's a better description of all this in Hesburgh 2013, included that citation. What we do is we take these reference conditions in white and we compare them to the landscape that we're currently interested in. And this is just an example landscape. Sorry, not the Upper Wenatchee. I don't have really pretty pictures like Jane had, outdoorsy stuff that makes you wish you were sitting outside. But this is the current condition, this is the current landscape, and we run through the exact same process of collecting that information for a current landscape. And we derive these items. I don't even know what the list is anymore. There's probably 100 or so items. They're all related to the primary variables that we identified within patches and then derived independently of one another. And the key piece to that is that all of these attributes then have some relationship related to forest structure without me being biased towards going in and delineating a whole new patch for some piece of habitat that was really interesting to me, but has no relevance to other pieces. And there's trade-offs to that, which we will not talk about today. This is what a contemporary photo interpretation looks like. You can see that there's, my photo interpreters are out there. They're doing a fair amount of field work. They're matching it up. They're collecting this information. They're using digital GIS, heads-up photo digitizing, 1 to 12,000 scale, classic resource photography, about 9-inch ground resolution. This is what it looks like when it's been, when attributes have been derived. The key thing here is that you'll notice that there's different patches with the same color. This is forest structure classes here, and what's happened essentially is you have different conditions that count as stem exclusion open canopy or young forest multi-story. We use the O'Hara and others forest classification or forest structure system. But that's important to note because for all intents and purposes, well, not all intents and purposes, for some purposes, the pink patches are going to function the exact same way, even though they have distinctly different underlying characteristics. But they still are functioning as stand initiation in terms of forest structure. And so there's variability within these different patches. And yes, they do relate back to real world things. This is a computer generated version of those forest structures, so we have an idea, so we can communicate it with people. I believe, yeah, top left, that was the pink stand initiation. Or it's a version of it anyhow. So what we do then is once we've derived these metrics is we run them through landscape, we run them through FragStats actually, which generates a series of landscape metrics. This basically tells us how all of these, the mosaic of various class types are functioning together. So in the case of cover, forest cover, this is telling us how all of the different forest cover types are interacting with one another across that landscape. It's an idea of landscape functionality between classes versus the class level metrics, which is actually looking at how functional or dysfunctional is a particular class. For example, ponderosa pine cover type on a landscape. If you take that and you think about something like a critical habitat, spotted owl habitat, this gives us an idea of how well or what the functionality, the patterns of spotted owl habitat look like across that landscape. And now I can compare that information to historical ranges. So on this graph, green represents the current, the HRV, historical range of variability. The orange actually represents an analog version of historical conditions, but they're actually warmer, drier watersheds. So those are watersheds that developed where we had more disturbance, where they were drier, more more competitive on site. And what we can see is we can see how these patterns change. On the bottom right, we've got landscape metrics. You can see that this landscape actually is pretty functional by itself. And then all the other ones are class level metrics. Top right's patch density. You can see that ponderosa pine is extremely high on the number of patches that exist. It's fragmented. And on the other hand, it's got a low, but not abnormally low, mean patch size in the top middle. And that basically tells us that we have a whole bunch of patches of ponderosa pine, and they're kind of normal, but they could be bigger. And especially if you look at that FRV, that yellow bar, right? Warmer, drier, we all think of Arizona, open ponderosa pine stands, right? Big park-like stands. Similar, except we're not pulling out of Arizona. So landscape assessments, man, 15 minutes is short, or 25 minutes is short. Landscape assessments with the objective. So this is my landscape. My graphics designer is on retainer for this stuff, so if you ever need them. Landscape assessment with landscape objective. So I basically have a landscape that I've done the analysis on. I've developed a patch. We looked at some of those patches a few minutes ago. I can develop a coarse filter patch objective. For something like young forest multi-story, I can go awesome. This is not what I was expecting. That's all right, though. So I can develop multiple options for what that looks like. I can take a young forest multi-story stand. I have 3 options: mechanical, fire, or no action, right? Mechanical treatment, a no action treatment, or a succession. Well, succession's the same. And so what that allows me to do then is basically develop patch level objectives that I am acknowledging that I have some error within that value, but that error is really low because of the scale that I'm looking at. And these patches are 4 hectares or larger, but it allows me then to consider creating this patch level objective in the pre-planning and proposal development. I can write an effects analysis to that, either by using practical common sense about how much of that ground I'm actually going to treat, or by just assuming the worst case scenario for my effects analysis if I'm going to treat that entire patch. Once I've developed that effects analysis, I have fine filter pieces of information that flow into that consideration. And when I'm doing timber sale layout, go all the way through this, the focus on this is trying to get folks out of the office staring at a computer screen and out into the woods actually doing what we do best, is really the short of this version. And what we're trying to do is create these course patch objectives that get us into NEPA and out of NEPA so we can talk about the effects and disclose those effects, and they get people out in the woods to actually get on the ground, do implementation, and treat the landscape. Part of that is is adaptive planning as well. This is actually the slide I was looking for. I'm glad I was in the wrong place. I got doubled. Hang on a second. Moving forward. Okay. So some of the critical components here are dealing with landscape to stand treatment objectives. We're coming at it from the opposite direction, where the landscape scale objective sets all of our objectives all the way down to the fine scale treatment stand. We're allowing for fine scale filters to inform us on where we're going to develop complex patches or where we're going to protect things. We're using a footprint approximating ecologically relevant patches. Key to all of this is that we're maintaining, to the best of our ability, all of our legacy structures, large and old trees, and obviously the late successional habitats that exist. We're looking for variability within treatments. We are not trying to reset that entire footprint to something different. We're trying to work within that footprint to change its functionality while still protecting all of the issues that we have there. Finally, adaptive management is really key to all of this, and really is key to all of what we're doing in planning, and that is actually having people on the ground who know what they're doing. They've got knowledge of the objectives that are occurring. They're communicating with each other, and they have a strict communication plan, and most importantly, the decision-making is clear. Who's making the decision and when do things stop? And this is a big part of adaptive management and the streamlined NEPA process that the Forest Service is talking about. I'm going to bail out so that Darren can jump up.